Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking and I found something really interesting. Check this out. So this is an article titled Ancient Mediterranean DNA Confirms Old Truths. People Contain Multitudes by Jill Kimball. And this is directly from Brown University, and for those of you who don't know, this is Brown University. It's actually quite interesting. Look at this. Got a lot of stuff, interesting courses and whatnot. And they're based in Providence, Rhode Island, United States. Now, before we jump into it, I'm always fascinated by DNA studies, particularly when they're done right. And this one is specifically about a population that we have discussed on this channel multiple times, the Phoenicians. So, what have they found out about the Phoenicians? I think you can already tell. Ooh, this is gonna upset a certain community. Let's go. An ancient DNA study co-authored by Brown archaeologist Peter van Dommelen illustrates the complexity of human migration and identity shifts over time. Identity is complicated. People develop a sense of self, not just from ancestry, but also from language, cultural traditions, environment, and personal experiences. So far, so good. For Peter van Dommelen, a professor of anthropology and archaeology at Brown University's, goodness gracious with the names, Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology and the Ancient World, that's the timeless takeaway from a recent analysis of ancient DNA he co-authored with 70 other researchers. So this is a big deal. This is not like a little thing, this is a big deal. 71, I guess, researchers. The study published in the journal Nature was led by scientists at Harvard University and Germany's Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. So, the study, ladies and gentlemen, is here. I already checked it out, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to actually read all of the specific details on the DNA analysis, but this is actually, for once, a good summary. The researchers conducted the largest ever DNA analysis of people who lived in the ancient Punic communities across the Mediterranean, from the Iberian Peninsula to North Africa to the Middle East. Their analysis revealed something that seemed counterintuitive. Despite the fact that Punic people originally came from the eastern Mediterranean, an area called the Levant, those who were living in Punic settlements several centuries later showed almost no trace of Levantine ancestry. Alright, so let me first explain a little bit. We're throwing around a few words here and I think we need to explain it. So, as you know, I first started by talking about the Phoenicians, and of course, the Phoenicians are a Levantine people. They come from the Levant, meaning sort of the eastern Mediterranean, and then they have settled and colonized certain areas, including, among others, North Africa, but as they say, Iberian Peninsula, so kind of modern-day Spain, and then parts of the Middle East where they were, of course, originally from. Thing is, though, that as centuries continue, what do these Phoenicians become? Well, Carthaginians, hence Punic. So, what the study is saying is that even though in their very origins, and there's no doubt about this, by the way, in academia, regardless of what other communities say, the original founders of Carthage were absolutely from the Levant, which means they were Semitic. That is a fact. That's why they're not even discussing other possible origins, like the idea that perhaps the original Phoenicians were in fact from the Horn of Africa or were from Central Africa. That's nonsense. And in fact, that's why they do say, as it is correct based on real academia, they were from the Levant. But what they're saying now is that as several centuries, the DNA study seems to suggest that by the time they become Carthaginians, they're not Semitic anymore, at least not in large numbers. So what are they now? What are they? International news headlines claim that the finding upended the world of archaeology and challenged long-held historical assumptions, but Van Dommelen doesn't think the study's findings is all that surprising, so he was expecting it. There seems to be a narrative today that our countries and economies are more interconnected than they used to be, but we have evidence that the ancient Mediterranean was a big interconnected web of people and ideas. Absolutely. I mean, that's obviously, yes. That's why, if you remember, oftentimes when I talk about interconnectivity in ancient communities, I always make a distinction between port cities, where I do say a certain level of multi-ethnicity, at least up to a certain extent, because of the fact that clearly the Mediterranean was a conduit of commerce, trade, and exchange and conquest. But if you go to like a medieval land, like, I don't know, Czechia, or even if you go to Germanic lands or Celtic areas in the classical period, well, these would have been quite ethnically homogeneous. So I agree with the professor. Open quotes, anthropologists have always said that the language, culture, and genetics are connected, but they don't necessarily inherently always go together, close quotes. Van Dommelen said, open quotes, throughout history, we see people move to new lands, adopt different customs, mingle with people from different cultures, and create new languages. Their identities shifts and don't necessarily align with their ancestry. It's what we have seen happen over the course of American history. Evidently, it's also what happened with Punic people in the Mediterranean. Okay, so what were they then? By the time they become Carthaginians, what were they? Levantine losses. Punic people, also known as Phoenicians or Carthaginians, first migrated from the Levant as early as the 12th century BC. Known as adept sea voyagers and purveyors of a unique purple dye made from seashells, they sailed to and settled on islands across the Mediterranean and on the mainland of present-day Spain, Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Their largest settlement was the city of Carthage in present-day Tunisia. Absolutely. The Punic Empire thrived for centuries as a dominant power in the Mediterranean until the rise of the Roman Republic. Over the course of about 100 years, beginning in the 3rd century BC, Rome gradually loosened the seafarers' hold on the Mediterranean in the Punic Wars, which culminated in the violent destruction of Carthage in the 2nd century BC. The word destruction sometimes can be misunderstood a little bit. They weren't completely and utterly annihilated. That's important to underline, because when we say destruction in the modern sense, it can be complete and utter annihilation due to the kind of power of our weapons. But when it comes to the classical period and even the Middle Ages, when they say a city has been destroyed, it usually doesn't mean that it's been leveled to the ground. And in fact, Carthage did continue to exist, even though they did sack it. They did do that. And also, there was no salting of the earth. That's nonsense. The researchers' DNA samples come mostly from the bones of people who lived in the second half of the Punic Empire's history, between the 6th and the 2nd century BC. The 210 samples came from 14 Punic settlements across the Levant, North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, Algeria, and the Balearic island Ibiza. We are literally talking about a very vast genetic pool. There is ample evidence that these people practiced Levantine customs, built Levantine-style structures, and spoke the Levantine-derived Punic language, Van Dommelen said. So they are maintaining the cultural connection to their origin. Yet, according to DNA analysis, almost none of them had any trace of Levantine ancestry. And this is surprising. This is surprising. Instead, the study found their genetic profiles looked most like those of prehistoric inhabitants of Sicily and the Aegean. Man, this is crazy. This is crazy. Big news, big news. So the Carthaginians were related to Sicilians of this period and the Aegean, which means Greece. And I mean, when you say Aegean, usually you mean Greece and some parts of the coast of the Anatolian Peninsula. But in this situation, considering the connection with Sicily, they were related to the Greeks.